Chapter 15 of The Wheel of Fortune by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, In the Hands of the Philistines.
"Why, Bert Hawley, is it possible this is you?"
It was the silvery voice of a very pretty girl of 16, charmingly attired, who had just stepped out of the private entrance of the Hotel Normandy. The hour was 8 in the evening, and the young lady, who was accompanied by a dudish young fellow 1 year her senior, was evidently bound for some place of amusement. Bert, who had the air of a prosperous New Yorker, turned in great surprise and recognized Helen Potts.
"Miss Helen!"
he exclaimed, seizing her hand with undoubted warmth.
"Are you really glad to see me?"
the girl asked with a shy demureness that well became her.
"Am I? Can you doubt it?"
he asked with an earnest eagerness that could not be mistaken.
"No, I don't doubt it, you ridiculous boy."
Then she stopped in some embarrassment, for she now recognized the fact that Bert was a different-looking boy to what he was the last time she had seen him on the morning of his departure from Jayville.
"Why, how well you look,"
she added in a confused way.
"Do I?"
said Bert.
"I'm glad you think so. Why, you look ever so prosperous and,"
with a blush, "just too handsome for anything."
"I'm afraid you're laughing at me, Miss Helen." "Not at all. I meant what I said. Have you made your fortune already?"
"Well, hardly," smiled Bert, "but I am bound to say I'm getting along very nicely."
"Jonas,"
she said, turning to her brother, who stood impatiently aside, chewing the head of his dapper little cane,
"haven't you anything to say to Bert Hawley?"
Young Potts stared at Bert, and then nodded superciliously. He had observed that the boy he had never liked was well dressed and looked a bit up in the world, as compared with what he had been in Jayville. But for all that, he wasn't quite prepared to admit that Bert was anywhere near as important in the world as himself. The fact that his father, Lawyer Potts, had recently made a good deal of money from some fortunate investment had caused Jonas to feel his oats more than ever.
"We were just going to the Hippodrome. Couldn't I persuade you to walk just a little way with us?"
asked Helen with a glance at Bert which carried the boy into the seventh heaven of delight. For if there was one person in the wide world Bert thought an awful lot of, that person was Helen Potts.
"I will be pleased to do so," he answered with alacrity.
Jonas turned up his nose, but his displeasure did not count, and the 3 young people, all natives of Jayville, Virginia, started off together.
"I'm just dying to hear all the news. I don't know what I ought to do with you, Bert," bubbled Helen Potts. "You haven't written half as regularly as you promised to do. The last I heard from you, you were in Philadelphia selling books. I think that was what you said you were doing. Have you given that up?"
"Not exactly," replied the boy. "I have been promoted, but I wrote you all about my good luck a week after I came to New York," he added in surprise.
"I'm sure I didn't get your letter then, for I am entirely in the dark as your having come to this city. When did you come?"
"The first of the year."
"Is it possible? And this is May! When I didn't hear from you for so long a time, I began to fear that either something had happened to you or that you had found some young lady you liked better than me," with an arch look.
"That can never be, Miss Helen," responded Bert gravely.
"You ridiculous— I beg your pardon," blushing. "You must really excuse my—"
"There is nothing to excuse, Miss Helen. If you will only continue to treat me in the same old way, it will give me great pleasure."
"You're very kind to say that, Bert. Perhaps I ought to call you Mr. Hawley now, but—"
"I hope you won't," he answered hastily.
"Well, I won't if you really prefer that I should not.
I much prefer Bert from you." She blushed again and did not say anything more for a moment or two. Then her embarrassment wore off, and they were soon chatting gaily. At length they arrived at the Hippodrome.
"I wish you would come in," she said with some earnestness. "Don't you think you could get a seat next to us?"
"I'm afraid not. The only chance would be to make an exchange with a speculator, but I have no right to ask you to do that."
"If you could get 3 seats together, I should very much prefer to have you get them. Jonas, hand our tickets to Bert."
Jonas did so grudgingly, for he saw that his sister would not be denied. By the payment of a couple of dollars, Bert exchanged his reserved seats for 3 others similarly situated, and the young couple entered the place of amusement. I am afraid the show, delightful as it was less enjoyed by Helen and Bert than the fact that they were in each other's company. At length the performance was over, and they came out of the house. A tall, dark-complexioned man with piercing black eyes and a slight mustache, who was watching the audience disperse, noticed Bert and gave a slight start. Then he walked briskly up to the three young people and said, "Have a carriage?" Bert was about to refuse when Jonas said, "How much for 2 to the Hotel Normandy?" "2?" said the dark man, glancing at each rapidly. "You mean 3, Jonas?" interposed his sister. 50 cents apiece," the man said quickly, leading the way toward a night owl which was standing a few steps away. Jonas gave a snort, for his plan to separate his sister from Bert had been nipped in the bud. Had Bert been better acquainted with New York, he certainly would have hesitated in trusting himself and companions to a night owl carriage, for they have a shady reputation. But as it was, he did not happen to be up to snuff in this particular, and so permitted the man, at whom he had merely glanced, to hand them all into the carriage and shut the door with a bang. The dark-complexioned man then mounted beside the driver, whispered in his ear, and in another moment the vehicle drove away from the curb. The cab proceeded rapidly down 6th Avenue for several blocks, and then turned into a side street toward the east. Jonas was the first to notice that the vehicle was taking an uncommonly long time to reach the hotel, although it was going at a smart rate. So he pushed open the door and shouted to the driver. The Jehu presently pulled up near the curb, and the dark man descended from his perch. "I say, where are you taking us to?" asked Jonas, putting his foot on the carriage step. "Hotel Normandy," replied the man. "Isn't that where you wanted to go?" "Yes, but—" The words were choked back by the jerk he received as he was landed on the sidewalk. "Hand over your watch and money," cried his assailant in a low, tense tone, "or I'll blow the whole top of your sconce off." And Jonas felt a cold muzzle of a revolver pressed against his temple. The driver, in the meantime, had descended on the opposite side and was opening the door, held Bert and Helen spellbound with a big bulldog revolver, which he swore he'd use if they uttered a sound. The dark-featured man was about to turn on Bert when a policeman suddenly appeared, running from the opposite side of the street. "Where, Hawk?" exclaimed the driver, slamming the carriage door and leaping to his seat. The accomplice was quick to take the alarm. He pushed Jonas away, jumped into the hack, and slammed the door just as the driver lashed his animal into a run. The policeman, seeing he was too late, pounded on the pavement with his nightstick and started full run after the fleeing vehicle. While this was going on, Bert had recovered his presence of mind and grappled with the man who had entered the cab. The boy was no easy proposition to handle. Months of hard farm work and subsequent intelligent gymnastic practice had given him muscles of steel, but he soon found he was at a great disadvantage in the close, swaying cab, which inconvenience did not seem to bother his companion half as much. The struggle, while it lasted, was fierce enough, Helen looking on half dazed with fear. The dark man brought matters to a sudden crisis by pulling out a slungshot and cracking the boy on the skull with it. Such a weapon might easily have inflicted a fatal wound, only for the inability of the person who used it to strike out with much strength in the confined space of the cab. The effect was sufficient, however, to effectually stun Bert, and he fell limply back on the cushions. At this, Helen gave one piercing scream and fainted. End of chapter 15.